Welcome, everyone. It's time for some time travel. Welcome to Becoming That One House, everyone. I am, of course, Jake, your host. Coming at you this week, we have a very special episode. I have given Josh and Ben the week off as I am out of town, and we are going to have a couple of very, very special guests walk you through something we think is very important. We have Tim Toonstra and Larry Carter walking you through the history of our church, because about roughly 20 years ago, I guess 19 years ago, they compiled this. It's a history of our church from its founding until at least what was the present day. Now, this has, of course, changed because, again, it's been almost 20 years. But we at this church feel that it is essential and part of our foundation to understand where we came from so that we can move forward and grow closer to God with that influence behind us. So with that, I would invite you to enjoy what we are lovingly dubbed Tim and Larry's Excellent Adventure. Part 1. A Church is Born.
Although Native Americans, of course, and earlier European settlers had been in Michigan for at least a couple centuries, it was by the middle of the 1800s that Michigan had largely been surveyed and there had been rapid settlement. Sparta Township began to be settled by about the early 1840s, largely along 10 Mile Road. Of course, with settlement came the organization of schools, local governments, and churches. Now, it just so happened two denominations tended to be very successful along the frontier. Those two were Methodists and Baptists, and they happened to be the first two churches organized in Sparta Township. By 1850, a group of people had organized what was called Alpine Sparta Free Will Baptist Church, probably along 10 Mile, possibly near this intersection of Vinton and 10 Mile Road, which is actually not far from where the Miller family lives today. In 1856, 9 members of that church decided to organize a new church toward the center of the township, closer to where they lived. They called themselves Sparta Free Will Baptist Church. Their founding was eloquently recorded in this old journal with an entry from that day illustrating how they began. It reads, "Believing that the time has arrived when it will be for the glory of God and the advancement of the Redeemer's kingdom here on earth, that a church should be organized and located at the Nash Schoolhouse. Therefore, a council was called June 14th, 1856, consisting of the following brethren, that is, Elders E.W. Norton, A.B. Toms, and Brother G.P. Stebbins organizing, Elder E.W. Norton as chairman, and Brother G.P. Stebbins as clerk. After proper examination, the following brethren and sisters were organized into a church, agreeable to the rules and regulations laid down in our treaties for the organization of Free Will Baptist churches." The 9 original members were Erastus Norton, who would become the church's first pastor; Abraham Toms, who lived in Alpine Township and also filled in as a pastor; Gaius Stebbins, who lived on the south side of 13 Mile near the intersection with Phelps Road; Cornwell Fenton, who at 60 was the oldest of the original members and is a distant relative of Betty Rosecoff. He lived on Sparta Avenue near O'Connor Road. Townsend and Nancy Walters lived on 13 Mile just across the township line in Algoma Township. Unfortunately, it appears Nancy passed away shortly after the church was formed. Zebulon Hinman was the youngest at 34 and was one of the first landowners in the northern part of the township, settling near the corner of Phelps and 15 Mile roads. And then finally, John and Valita Belcom, who lived on Sparta Avenue north of 13 Mile.
Originally, the church met at the Nash Schoolhouse across the street here. After about 10 years, they decided to build a building, and so they went right around the corner on South State and we'll take a look at that next. The original church building was constructed on this location. It is also the site where, earlier, the founder of Sparta, Jonathan Nash, built a cabin. It is now occupied by the cafe, fireside lounge, and offices. Keep this spot in mind because we'll pick up the old church story on the other side of the windows here. Unfortunately, we don't have any pictures of the original church building, but many at the time described it as nearly identical to the original Methodist church building, which we do have a picture of. So this is a picture that is not of our church, but looks very much like our church.
Part 2. Two influential pastors.
Probably no two pastors have been more influential in the history of Sparta Center Church than Erastus Norton and John Maynard, our first two pastors.
Reverend Norton was instrumental in the church's founding. He pastored the church through many of its first 20 years, and he remained active after the church hired its first full-time pastor. He was not full-time. Since he was also a member of the Sparta community, after his death in 1887, he was buried here in Greenwood Cemetery on this spot marked by this monument. No pastor, however, has served longer than John Maynard, who pastored the church for 35 years between 1875 and 1905. He was not only the pastor for our church, but along with his role as a justice of the peace, was in many ways also a pastor for the entire Sparta community. It is estimated he baptized over 200 people, married more than 1,200 couples, and buried more than 1,000. The words on the headstone describe Reverend Maynard's effect on the community.
In Memoriam, Reverend John H. Maynard. Pastor, Free Baptist Church, Sparta, Michigan, for 30 years. His labors were the crowning work of a Christian life, given to God in ceaseless endeavor for his fellow men, erected by a loving public.
A few days after his death, Jeannie Gillette, the church secretary, wrote in the minutes of a church meeting, "A very sad covenant meeting today. It is the first since Elder Maynard died on the 15th of May. Like Reverend Norton, Reverend Maynard is also buried here in Greenwood Cemetery." Speaking of someone who was influential in the community, the Bettis headstone, right here, has, among others, two brothers, one who was an inventor and an undertaker in town. It's likely that George Bettis's inspiration for inventing a center line road marker in the late 20s, which was used on northern Kent County roads, was due to the devastation caused by head-on collisions, which he saw firsthand in his line of work. George had a number of other inventions, but most importantly, he bestowed an invaluable gift by filming Sparta events from the early 1930s on into the early 60s. His brother Jesse ran the stockyards in Sparta, and he died here in Sparta on December 7th, 1941, a few hours after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, ushering the U.S. into World War II. There are a number of stories like this in our 4 cemeteries in Sparta Township, just waiting to be told.
Part 3. Change, Change, Change.
By the beginning of the 20th century, social changes were occurring across the U.S. For example, the majority of the population ended up living in big cities, reinforcing the stereotypes of small towns and small town churches. Over a few short decades, electricity was introduced into most homes and businesses, but was not immediately installed in our church building because some members felt that electricity was nothing but a passing fad. It was, however, telecommunications that greatly expanded during this time, especially by way of the telephone and radio, which now allowed people not only to communicate long distances, but to hear church services in the comfort of their homes. And the mass production of automobiles soon expanded mobility of families, which in turn allowed families to travel many miles to church as opposed to attending the neighborhood church.
The importance of the car to most families was eventually reflected in the introduction of summer Sunday night drive-in church on this spot on the corner of 12 Mile Road and Sparta Ave. These services lasted into the early 1960s and are still remembered by a few in our congregation, including my wife. So ask Sally about it. I'm hoping that Bill Moore and Dave Rosekoff will forgive me for using their Sunday morning spot without asking. Although as I look around, I don't see your names on any of these chairs, gentlemen. For our church, one early change was a significant renovation in the late 1890s. The building was expanded to the north and east, and a balcony was added. It is in this building that a number of our older members can still remember. A few stories can be told here also regarding sitting in that balcony. While it was a great privilege for a kid to sit up there, that privilege also came with great responsibility to obey parents who warned of big trouble if their kid got called out for any reason. Hard to imagine, I know, but I and some of my friends got chewed out one time from the preacher in the pulpit, no less, for our inability to keep our mouths shut. These are two pictures that show the same pillars in a combined Baptist Methodist Vacation Bible School. They're in very close proximity originally to where we've placed them when we built the cafe in 2018. Thanks to Steve Cummings, whose dad Vernon saved one from the old church, whereupon we ripped the length of it and created two. The 1890s renovation also included the addition of a baptismal tank. This is a later iteration from the baptistry described below. While the baptisms were preferable to using Rogue River, especially in the winter months, they were still always very uncomfortable. Decades later, longtime member Georgia Walker recalled her 1924 baptism. And this is the story. On an Easter Sunday, Pastor Stevens had candidates for baptism by immersion. The church was old and the baptistry was a large wooden tank located under the platform in the front part of the auditorium. A large cover opened up for baptisms. He painted the tank on the inside so it was a pure white. The top of it was decorated with geraniums and ferns. A little canary bird completed the decorations. The janitor, an elderly man, had to fill the baptistry with water and have it warm by 7 o'clock in the morning, which was the time set for the service. He came to the church about 3 o'clock in the morning to fire the furnace, heat the water, as well as the auditorium. He did so well that one of the candidates, Ruth Jean Filkins, came up out of the water with her face red, and she was steaming all over. I was standing where I could see her, for I was the next one to be baptized.
Along with social changes during the early 20th century, winds of theological change were also blowing across many denominations, some blowing away from biblical beliefs and practices. Older denominations divided, and several new denominations formed. One reaction to these changes in our church was the adoption by the 1930s of our first official statement of faith, which outlined the very foundational beliefs that we have. And then in the 1940s, we left the Northern Baptist Convention, which we'd been part of for nearly 40 years, and joined a new network of churches called the Conservative Baptist Association of America. We also, along with that, affiliated with the Conservative Baptist Foreign Mission Society, which led to the first direct support of missionaries.
The first missionaries that we helped send out were Harvey and Vera Shaw and their 3 children. They arrived in Africa for the first term in 1938, spent 4 years serving there until it was decided to bring them home in 1942 because of the potential dangers involving World War II. On their way back to the States, their ship was torpedoed by a German U-boat. Vera and their oldest daughter, Georgia, died as a result of the attack. Harvey was severely injured, was on one of 4 life rafts that drifted away, and was never seen again. The 2 younger children, Richard and Carol, spent 20 days on a raft in the Atlantic Ocean and were eventually rescued. Their harrowing account was retold in 2 books, Adrift and In Peril on the Sea. Chelsea in the office got a call from Richard Shaw's son a few months ago, and I was able to talk to and share with him pictures that their sending church, had that the Shaw family hadn't seen before. It made the account one that I'd heard of as a kid come alive 80 plus years after the tragedy.
Part 4, Ministry Expansion.
Following World War II, which, by the way, was a war in which many men in our congregation have served, including my father, who flew on a B-29 over in Asia. Following that war, though, there was an increase in the birth rate across the U.S., and that, combined with many people moving into the Sparta area, led to a significant increase in the number of children. That, in turn, was a contributor to new construction within our church building and the development of new ministries within our church.
One result was the construction of a gymnasium and parsonage in the early 1950s in order to provide space for classrooms, sports activities, and church functions, including the center of all church fellowship, the potluck. In many ways, it was ahead of its time, only the second gym in town. In 1954, only the high school had a gym. Tim found in some church minutes the lodging of a criticism early in the life of the ballroom. The rearrangement of the ballroom because of a hazardous beam was not implemented, and decades later, people still bang their heads on it. A second response to the growing number of children was the 1959 hiring of Al Jones, the church's first assistant pastor for youth. The first of 17 who have filled that role, including Doug Bitework, whose influence continues to be felt to this day, Nate Wagner, who moved on to be the lead pastor, and Josh Murray, who leads our youth today. This is an evidence of Josh being with us. It just dawned on me as I walked into the auditorium that it'll be 50 years ago, next June, that I walked down this aisle and married Sally Toonstra. But we're here to talk about the auditorium. Finally, in the late 1960s, the auditorium, parts of which went back 100 years, was torn down. During a year-long construction, we did church in the gym, and the old church was replaced with a new auditorium and basement classrooms, which is the auditorium we use and enjoy today, just this morning, and not just for services, but also baptisms, concerts, weddings, funerals, and children's programs. SBC has a long-standing practice of praising God in music. In its 169 years of existence, piano and organ and voices were early instruments of music worship in early years. A youth and music staffer through the early 1960s, Dex Rome, brought his saxophone onto the platform to accompany the piano and organ in congregational hymns. From inside and out of church, soloists, duets, trios, quartets, small ensembles through large choirs have provided what we call, sounds kind of quaint now, but special music. Choirs of all ages had their seasons of ministry. There's a long line of choir directors over the years as well. In the 1930s and well into the 40s, one particular choir director, the pastor's wife, Mrs. Odegaard, had a special connection with her high school choir, acting like a loving mom to them. Others, including our own Renaissance man, Brent Lister, spent time with the baton trying to keep choir members in check and sounding melodic. In the 70s and 80s, a group of 8 or 9 vocalists, the Free Life Singers, sang often and traveled to various area churches. Other early instruments, in addition to the piano, organ, and violin, ranged from musical glasses, musical saws, and the zither, accordion, string quartets, to the marimba, think Carol Draper. The music itself, hymns, gospel, choruses, octavios, up through drama-added cantatas, were effective medium to convey the message. SBC has long been blessed with a list of accompanists on the keyboard along the way. It was a long night in choir practice when the piano player called in sick. 2 of our longest serving, in my memory, Beatrice Bellamy and Peggy Odrin, have ministered long and faithfully at piano and organ. Of special note is a family whose interaction with music is long and wide. The patriarch, a farmer on Peach Ridge, took piano lessons from Peggy Odrin. As she often does, Peggy encouraged this man in his 70s to do special music in Sunday evening church. Richard Johnson would tickle the ivories, sometimes very tentatively, playing his favorite hymns. Dick's son Roy traveled all over the world with the Michigan 126th Army Band, and his daughter, Laura Dodge, played the keyboard for a number of years. She was a member of the Kent Philharmonic Orchestra, and she led music for vacation Bible schools. Dick's great-granddaughter, and Roy and Patty's granddaughter, and Matt and Jessica Curtis's daughter, Tori Scheckler, 30 years later, plays the keyboard and the guitar and the drums and who knows what else as she leads our praise team each Sunday. When you sing along with the praise team next week, thank God for the keyboardists, the guitar players, the bass players, the drummers and the violinists, the chorale, and even those who sit on that box and beat out rhythms whose name I can never remember. They use their God-given talents to practice and then to minister each week. The rhythms, tempos, and instruments change, but thank God that the message does not. We can be thankful for the great legacy of music at Sparta Baptist, now Sparta Center Church.
Of course, change has continued in modern times, and change within our church is no exception. For example, since the 1960s, missions trips have become part of both adult and youth ministry. In the early 2000s, contemporary music, praise and worship became a larger part of our Sunday services. And as Larry mentioned, we continue to enjoy a highly talented praise team today. And while we are an independent church, we have joined an association called Converge, which provides significant support for member churches and pastors. And then finally, in 2023, the church voted to change the name to Sparta Center Church, which is at least the 4th name of our church in its 170-year history. In fact, one of the most interesting names was we were at one time called the Church on the Side of the Road, reflecting its proximity to M37 at the time. Some things, however, have never changed. Our purpose has not changed. We still exist for the glory of God and the advancement of the Redeemer's kingdom. And we continue to believe unapologetically that the Bible is the true and authoritative foundation of our beliefs and practices, that salvation is found only in Jesus, and that following Him is the most important thing in our lives. May these continue to be the foundation of our church in the future.
A more detailed history of our church can be found in our written history, copies of which can be made available by contacting Larry Carter or signing up at the Welcome Center. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Becoming That One House podcast. That was what I'm calling, at least, Tim and Larry's Excellent Adventure. Next week, I'm actually going to have Tim and Larry here to kind of discuss history, basically, and I'm really excited about that. So I hope that you'll join us. Until then, you can check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, all your standard social medias. You can ask us questions, and if you ask us questions via these cards or via the standard question methods by asking me, Josh, Ben, or emailing info@spartacenter.org, or just emailing Jake, I guess, at spartacenter.org as well. Your questions may be featured on next week's podcast. Who knows? Other than that, I just want to make it clear, this history comes from this book that Tim and Larry wrote in 2006, I believe. Yeah, 2006, nearly 20 years ago. And so, yeah, it's a good read. I would highly recommend it. If you want a copy of it, you can see Larry. He will be sure to get it in your hands. Other than that, thank you for listening and have a great week.